Now, this article sparked my interest last week. There's a neo-Nazi who helped lead a campaign to threaten journalists and Jewish activists in 3 states, and he was sentenced Tuesday to 7 years in federal prison, the longest prison term handed out to the participants in this conspiracy. A jury convicted Caleb Cole in September of 5 felony counts related to the delivery of swastika-laden posters to journalists and employees of the ADL, the Anti-Defamation League in Washington State, Arizona, and Florida in early 2020. The posters warned, "You have been visited by your local Nazis. Your actions have consequences. And we are watching." The judge noted that Cole, 26, had tried to operate under the anonymity of the internet, and that when journalists, including Chris Ingalls of Seattle's King TV, exposed him, he took great pains to silence them through threats and intimidation. To function as a democratic society, we need reliable and truthful journalism. Unlike others who were sentenced in the case, Cole expressed no remorse, which helped him explain why his sentence was more than twice as long as that of the conspiracy's other leader, Cameron Shea. At his sentencing, Shea told the court, "I cannot put into words the guilt that I felt about this fear and pain that I caused." Cole, most recently of Montgomery, Texas, was a leader of a hate group called Atomwaffen Division. He and 4 others faced charges, including conspiracy, mailing threatening communications, and interfering with a federally protected activity. The posters included images such as a hooded figure preparing to throw a Molotov cocktail at a house, and the words, "Death to Pigs," the same message followers of Charles Manson scrawled in victims' blood during a home murder. Cole had been on law enforcement's radar since at least 2018, when he was stopped at U.S. Customs. Upon returning from a trip to Europe, authorities searched his cell phone and found photos of him posing at various sites, including at the gates of Auschwitz, of displaying a white supremacist flag and performing the Nazi salute. Assistant U.S. Attorney Thomas Woods disagreed, saying Cole stood out from the other defendants for his lack of remorse. He decried racism and religious intolerance and said, "It is the great tragedy of this country. 250 years in, so many Americans have that feeling of unease." That was his identity, his life's work, to point to this. Hate, targeting people will instill terror. And it worked. Now, it's hard to believe today in America that we still get those kind of threats, and that Nazism is still alive and doing well. And then I remembered from my childhood, growing up back in Nebraska, that there was a gentleman there. His name was Gary. He later changed his name to Gerhard, and his last name was Lauck, L-A-U-C-K, Gary Lauck. Infamous. I always thought of him as sort of a troll, but the ADL, the Southern Poverty Law Center, say, oh, no. Gary Lauck, Gerhard Lauck, is very dangerous. For 30 years, he was the main propagator of Nazi propaganda in the world. And he would ship it into Germany. which was illegal. You could not have Nazi propaganda in Germany. And he went over there and flouted it and was put in jail for, I believe, 4 months. And here's the unfortunate part, is that Gary Lauck came from Milwaukee as a young child. His father got hired by the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, and Gary landed in Lincoln, Nebraska, and made Lincoln, Nebraska, for the better part of 20 years, the main institutional place for the distribution and printing of Nazi propaganda throughout the world. Lincoln, Nebraska was the Nazi headquarters in the world because of Gary Lauck. Now, here's the story I was aware of as a child growing up in Lincoln, is that Gary, who has a speech impediment, he pronounces his R's as W's, and so when he was a child, people would make fun of Gary in his speech. And so he would tell people that he was German, and that he did not have a speech impediment, he had a German accent, which was not true. But it helped him save face on the playground, I guess. And so, to propagate that lie and that myth, he changed his name to Gerhard. And even when he speaks today, he sounds German because of his speech impediment, not because he knows German. And the story that lives in infamy that very few people know is that in 1970s, 71, 72, around there, when Gary graduated from East High School, he was already very deep into the world of the Nazis. And Gerhard, was also very smart. And at one of the first graduation ceremonies of the new East High School in Lincoln, Nebraska, Gary was giving the, I believe, valedictorian speech. And he took the stage with his mortarboard and his robe, and he began speaking about freedom and the topic that had been approved for him to discuss. And then, as if out of an episode of The Twilight Zone, Gary started speaking with a German accent, changing the topic of his speech to things about freedom and anti-Jew, and he removed his mortarboard, and from within his robes he pulled out a black Nazi hat, and as he's speaking, he's taking off his robe and revealing a Nazi uniform underneath, a brown shirt with the Nazi arm emblem. Good to have a back door. And the tie, and the leather thing across your top. And then he started, I guess, speaking in German and ended the rest of his speech with, of course, the I'm not going to do it, but the Heil Hitler salute. And he was very quietly and demurely bumped off stage. And that became the meta-history of Gerhard Lauck in Lincoln, Nebraska. And that was the beginning of his Nazism in Lincoln, Nebraska. Went to the university for a couple of years, I'm sure on free paid tuition because his father taught there, dropped out, dedicated his entire life from that point on to Nazi propaganda, printing pamphlets, sold a lot of Nazi stickers, Nazi flags, and gained a reputation. And then over time, the thing that sort of diminished him was the internet. Because people who were of that mind didn't have to rely on Gary to help sell their hate. They didn't have to buy stickers from Gary anymore. They could just go on the internet, start their own website, collect their own money, and spew their own viciousness without needing to go through Gary. So in some ways, the internet saved Lincoln, Nebraska from Gary. And Gary, as I understand it, moved to Beatrice for a while and is in Fairbury or bouncing around. But this is what Gerhard looks like now, sort of now, calling him the Farm Belt Führer, which I think just plays right into his ego. I still think this is a big ego play, even though he's very dangerous, according to the ADL and the Southern Poverty Law Center. But this is really a very deep and interesting conversation about Gerhard. I'll put the link in chat. And an in-depth interview written by Carson Vaughn, who is also from Nebraska. I had a sociology class at UNL as a freshman, and the first thing that I was told is, are you aware that Lincoln, Nebraska, your hometown where you've lived all your life, is the center of Nazi propaganda throughout the world? And all of us, except me, because I heard the story about Gary at East High School, were shocked and gasped, and how dare they? And then they showed us some of the pamphlets that he would provide. So this is sort of a, I don't want to say it's a love note to Gary, but in some ways it's very admiring of him. It doesn't really condemn him or what he did to people. Now this is a different story. This is the Southern Poverty Law Center with Gerhard Lauck. And this is their page that they've dedicated to him. Gary Lauck, an American with a put-on German accent because of his speech impediment, and Hitlerite mustache, is often referred to as the Farm Belt Führer. From his home in Lincoln, Nebraska, Lauck exported or smuggled millions of pieces of neo-Nazi propaganda in 10 languages to at least 30 countries in the 1990s. Extremist info, born 1953. Ideology, neo-Nazi. A Hitler fan since age 11, Gerhard Lauck, an American with a put-on accent. Also founded the NSDAPAO, the German language acronym for National Socialist German Workers' Party Overseas Organization, the translated name of the original Nazi Party's overseas unit. He exported or smuggled millions of pieces of neo-Nazi propaganda in 10 languages to 30 countries and became a key player in the resurgence of the German neo-Nazism in the 1990s. And that's what the ADL says. This is what makes him very dangerous, is that he's not just printing stuff, he's acting on it. Arrested in 1995 in Denmark, Lauck would wind up spending 4 years in prison in Germany for all of his activities. By the time he emerged, the internet had supplanted him as an easy-to-mine source for neo-Nazi propaganda in countries where it is illegal. In Gary's own words, our purpose, the defense of the white race, survival of our white race and of the various white nations, is our prime directive, our worldview, called National Socialism. It is based upon the laws of nature and the lessons of history. Our two highest values, race and nation. Our goal, white power. Now, doesn't that sound familiar? Didn't we just get done with the whole January 6th invasion, touting a lot of those same ideas? May some of you become examples for those who will later join our ranks, Gary said, and carry on the holy swastika banner, where we too are called to that great storm troop in the sky. Gary also said National Socialists form a living community a community of faith, and a community of struggle. This consciousness of community, this sense of purpose, and this deeply felt duty to defy all odds and battle every enemy, despite decade after decade of relentless persecution, vilification, and sacrifice, is absolutely essential to our long-term survival and final victory. Individuals fall away. Organizations come and go. Neighborhoods and whole cities are destroyed. Perhaps even entire nations will perish during the new millennium. But the race must survive. Pretty frightening stuff. And not unlike the political dialogue that we heard a lot from the far right in America. And his background, Gary became a Nazi at age 11. The same year his family moved to Nebraska from Milwaukee. Growing up, he says he was teased by classmates for speaking with a speech impediment that sounded suspiciously like a German accent. At that point, he says, I became a fanatic. Not only with my heart, but with my mind. At 19, he changed his name to Gerhard, his first step toward assuming a fully Nazified persona. Now, what's really interesting about that is how peers and friends and enemies can adversely shape the life of a vulnerable young mind. And was it this school ground teasing of Gary and his speech impediment that forced him into this wild and reckless form of a propaganda life? You know how kids think. Oh, you think I'm a German? Oh, well, let me call up the power of Hitler and let me change my name to Gerhard. And we'll see who's the German. And we'll see who gets hurt. And this is not the only place I've heard this about Gary, is that he was teased for being German and then he decided to become German and the worst of Germany. He wanted to become his tormentor's worst enemy. And look what happened. Did he find success? In his mind, he found success. To the rest of us, he's a ridiculous troll. To other people, he's a very dangerous voice that people are listening to. Lauck spent his early years as a member of the neo-Nazi Socialist White People's Party, the successor organization to the American Nazi Party, founded by George Lincoln Rockwell, and later the Chicago-based National Socialist Party of America, led by Frank Collin. The NSPA imploded after two stunning events: the revelation that Frank Collin was the son of Max Cohen, a Jewish concentration camp survivor, and the subsequent discovery made by Lauck and two colleagues of photographic evidence that Collin was also a child molester. In 1974, Lauck founded the NSDAPAO, which is officially dedicated to promoting a worldwide national socialist-led white revolution for the restoration of white power in all white nations. Lauck defied European bans on Nazi paraphernalia and propaganda by flooding the continent with anti-Semitic propaganda at a time when it was nearly impossible to get. Certainly the most important activity he has undertaken in the furtherance of neo-Nazism. During the 80s and the 90s, Lauck produced, translated, and helped smuggle into Germany huge amounts of German-language propaganda, as many as 8 million pieces a year. Overall, Lauck exported hate materials in 10 languages in 30 countries. Lauck had several run-ins with the German authorities in the 70s, a 1972 arrest for distributing Nazi literature, a 74 expulsion after giving a speech in Hamburg on why Hitler is still so popular in the United States, and a 1976 arrest while carrying 20,000 Nazi posters. After that arrest, Lauck served a 4-month term in a German prison. He was then deported and banned from Germany for life. So there you have it. Gary Lauck, Gerhard Lauck. And in 2001, had a little problem in the state of Nebraska. Lancaster County's attorney's office filed an information charging appellant Gary Rex Lauck, also known as Gerhard Rex Lauck, with providing false information, a Class 4 felony, on an application for a handgun. In 1999, Lauck filled out an application for a handgun permit, produced his driver's license for identification, and the name, address, and date of birth, which Lauck filled out on the application form, matched that same information on his driver's license. On the application to purchase, lease, rent, or receive transfer of handgun, Lauck circled no to the question. Have you been convicted in any court of a crime punishable by imprisonment for a term exceeding 1 year? Note: a yes answer is necessary if the judge could have given a sentence of more than 1 year. A yes answer is not required if you have been pardoned for the crime or conviction, has been expunged or set aside, or you have had your civil rights restored under the law where the conviction occurred. You are now prohibited from receiving or possessing a firearm. Well, he was charged with providing false information. At the preliminary hearing, translated German documents indicated 517 that in Germany, Lauck was arrested and sentenced to jail for 4 years for incitement of the people, inciting racial hatred, distributing means of propaganda, and using symbols of an anti-constitutional organization. The county court bound over Lauck to the district court. So what happened is Gary lost. He tried to appeal his conviction and it didn't work. And here's an older article about Gary, the German-American Gary Rex Lauck, who is fast expanding his influence among neo-Nazi youth, especially in Germany, has been politically active since the 70s. And here's another story I'll share with you in chat. Gary and his propaganda. He's making a whole world out of this. And so in some way, you can't get away from him. And here, believe it or not, like it or not, Gerhard Lauck is on the Twitter. Free speech and all, right, folks? He's a book publisher, a free speech archive activist, and former political prisoner. And then he has his website. And he put up the website in response to the internet because other people were stealing his hatred and his thunder. So this is what he created. Zunzify. So he will host your hate website and market you. And it's all under the guise of free speech. Now, he hasn't really been active very much since 2019. But this is his new, I call it, troll scamming, where he now sees himself as a paradigm of freedom. Freedom of thought. Freedom to hate whomever you want. And I'll publish it online. Publishing in an era of censorship. Arcane semantics. This is what he now believes in. That he is doing good work. He is telling the other side of the Holocaust. He promotes white pride. And it's all very sad and very noted and very disgusting. And if you're interested in reading a little further about this, this is my article written in 28 about Gary. And why do we care about Gary? Why are all these articles about Gary? Because we're calling attention to people who are causing trouble and are hating and who are making life difficult for people just because of what they believe in. And there's the link to the blog article. So it's a sad story about Gary, a picked upon child, speech impediment, lonely, looking for meaning, and he gets led astray by history. Not anyone in particular, really. This is just something that he obviously decided as a kid. Well, you're making fun of me. I'm going to get back at you, becoming your worst nightmare of what a resurrected Germany would look like in America. And he's been very successful. And in some of these small towns where he kind of lives and moves around, he's not really respected, but he's also not condemned. Oh, that's Gary being Gary. As long as he doesn't bother us, well, it doesn't bother me. Let him live. Let him do what he wants to do. And that is how terrible things happen. And how terrible things become real. And how the nightmare of the child becomes the monstrous reality of the adult. And that is my Nebraska Nazi story. I hope I won't have others to share in the future, but who knows where we're going from here. Now, just to put a final thought again on the Nebraska Nazi Gary Lauck, Gerhard Lauck. I don't believe, Jana asked me, did he change his name legally to Gerhard? And everything I can see is no. Especially when we look at that warrant problem with his gun, also known as Gerhard. His legal name is Gary. And, you know, Gary lived in the minds of many of us who sort of kept him alive as a disgruntled amusement. But it makes you wonder, after the thing at his high school graduation, and the revelation of himself as a Nazi. And it reminds me of a play. There was a play that's very interesting about this family. I believe it's a one-act play. And they're all sitting around the kitchen table and talking, laughing. Mother talks about this, Dad talks about this, they're playing. The kids are playing, they have a wonderful life, a beautiful home, the future is bright. And then the dad has to get up from the table and go to work, and he puts on his jacket, buttons his coat, puts on his Nazi hat, and goes to work. And the zinger is, we've been watching this guy for half an hour. He's wonderful, he's funny, he's charming, he's a terrific father, and his day job is working in the SS. And the last scene, moments of the play, are him getting into his Nazi regalia. And I believe that play was written after the Gerhard Lauck thing. But back to Gary, it makes me wonder, what if someone had intervened and, you know, sat him down? In his family, I guess his mother was the only one who was sort of sane in the family. His father was at UNL, kind of off, and Gary was into Marxism and Hitlerism and read Mein Kampf. That if someone had taken a chance to sit him down and talk to him and try to deprogram him just a little bit, and try to find out the root of this monstrosity that took hold of him so young. Did nobody care? Did no one in the family try to convince him of another way? Well, it doesn't appear there was any effort put into that. And look what happened. Became his own sort of doomsday bomb. And it's a sad thing. And in the Midwest, unfortunately, if he were somewhere else, I don't think he would have been able to get away with that behavior in New York City. I think there would have been interventions done and punishments handed out to him. But in Lincoln, Nebraska, in that time, either the 70s or the late 60s, whenever it happened, he was shuffled off the stage. Don't talk about it. Pretend it didn't happen, and it will go away. I believe it was reported in the newspapers, but after that, the teachers didn't want to talk about it. The school system didn't want to talk about it. Nobody wanted to talk about Gary and what he did. And it should have just been the opposite. The whole town should have been talking about what Gary did and condemning it and finding him and helping him to find a different way. Because obviously he has the power to influence people. Obviously he is charismatic. Obviously people are attracted to whatever Gary Gerhard has. People are interested in that in him. And we have to wonder why. Then we sort of see that sort of same thing playing out in our national politics right now. Or we have a hurt child living in Florida. Says he's in exile, says he won the election, and he's full of rage and vengeance and white supremacy. It's the same sort of thing.